Hi there, class. This is the follow-up lecture that I told you I would be doing for you guys. What we're going to do is we're going to concentrate mainly on the 1970s and 1980s. I'll give you a lot more facts and figures for those two decades than I will for the 1990s. 1990s will be probably pretty free-flowing. You'll still need to take notes, but I won't be expecting you to know or remember as much from that decade than from the 70s and 80s. That way we get you all the way up to the end of the Cold War and the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, and then we just sort of have a discussion via the media of YouTube about the 1990s and the early 2000s. One of the things that I wanted to do, since we felt a little rushed at the end of last class period, I was going to review some of the, or re-review some of the slides that we went over last class period. So let's kind of wrap up the Vietnam War and what was going on at that time period. Now, just to remind you guys, from 1965, after, of course, the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, to 1968, American leaders from President Lyndon Johnson all the way down to William Westmoreland, the man you see here on the screen, were telling Americans that we were winning in Vietnam, that we were eliminating the enemy. Of course, we talked about in class how this war of attrition had a negative effect on many of the troops in the field because they couldn't see that success that Westmoreland spoke of. They couldn't see the victory or the light at the end of the tunnel. All they saw were their friends dying, taking worthless pieces of rice paddy and jungles, and things like that, only to leave it for the enemy to reacquire it. And of course, Americans started to get this kind of feeling as well as they watched the news on the TV. And the Tet-68 that broke out in late January 1968 during the Chinese New Year of Tet reconfirmed America's suspicions that this war was unwinnable and that they had been lied to, as we talked about near the end of class. That during this uprising, the VC, the Viet Cong, which had been infiltrating the major urban areas of Da Nang, Saigon, and most notably Hue, the old imperial palace or imperial capital of Vietnam. They overran American forces around the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. They took the entire city. When I say city, I mean the center of the city of Hue. They threatened major and minor provincial capitals throughout South Vietnam. Now, while the U.S. forces, with the help of South Vietnamese forces, were able to eradicate, and I mean eradicate, the VC, what Americans saw on TV was the complete polar opposite of what we were being told by Westmoreland, Johnson, and other leaders in this country. So while it was a victory on the battlefield for American forces, the VC would not be a threat for the rest of the war, and the North Vietnamese would have to start sending increasing numbers of their regular army south to fight this war now that the Viet Cong was gone. But it was a strategic defeat in that we start to see the American public start to turn against the war. Now, the biggest media that, of course, was affecting America's views on Vietnam, of course, was the new media of the television. Nightly news was still a relatively new thing for the American public. You've got to think of it this way. When TV was first introduced in the late 40s and early 1950s, programming was haphazard. It wasn't until the mid to late 1950s that we see the nightly news hour that we take for granted, or at least took for granted, around 6 o'clock. So this new media, where pictures from far-off places are brought into American homes directly within hours sometimes, days mostly, but hours sometimes, excuse me, put Americans there on the front line of the Vietnam War. And so, what was the effect of the media? Many conservatives today argue that the media was biased. Well, in effect, they are right, but they believe in liberal bias. In a lot of ways, the Vietnam War was a creation of the media. I've actually done a little research into the effect of media, both print and television, on American involvement in Vietnam. And in the early 1960s, the American press was majority for the war. One of the reasons why Americans were not told about, or at least when they heard about the assassination of Ninh Dong Diem, yeah, I know I'm butchering that name because I'm not Vietnamese, but when Diem was assassinated, this was actually a good thing as reported in the American press. Diem and his government was seen as corrupt and not fulfilling its responsibility of fighting, of course, the Cold War. It was the media that supported the Tonkin Gulf Resolution in 1964. It was the media that initially supported Lyndon Johnson's escalation of the war with Operations Rolling Thunder and the movement of American troops into South Vietnam. So, in a lot of ways, American involvement was pushed by the media, only to have radio, television, and print media turn against the war by 1968. And of course, by 1968 going into 1970, this war is seen as a negative. It's a war, it's the wrong war. It is a failed war, a war for a corrupt government in South Vietnam, a country that the American press increasingly characterized as a military dictatorship. Now, one thing changed also in 1968 besides Test 68. We have to, of course, look at who was president, and many commentators, not really historians, but commentators, have pointed out that, of course, before 1968, Lyndon Johnson was president. After 1968, Richard Nixon was president. And let's just be honest, the media has always hated Richard Nixon. When he was vice president in the 1950s, he was the butt of jokes, and throughout his presidency in the late 60s and early 70s, the media characterized his presidency as, again, corrupt, as warmongering, and of course, he would be brought down by media reports of possible corruption in the Watergate scandal. So what are the costs of this war in Vietnam that, again, sap American strength? Well, again, Americans can't follow on a map like they could in World War II of battle lines moving forward. Instead, Americans hear news reports of body count and percentages, that so many percentage of American soldiers died, of course outweighed by so many of the enemy that died. The other thing that sapped American strength was that by 1968 the Vietnam War was gobbling up enormous amounts of the American budget. Many American conservatives didn't like the war because they believed that it was actually weakening our stance against the real enemy, the Soviet Union, because America was cannibalizing our forces abroad, for example in Europe, to send troops, men, and materiel to fight in Vietnam. But the biggest opponents of the war, as we talked about, are people your guys' age. People in just out of high school, 18, 19, 20 years old. The average age of an American soldier in World War II was 21 to 22 years old. The average age of a Vietnam trooper, Vietnam grunt, as they were called, these troops that would, as they called it, hump through the bush, meaning you're humping that backpack like a camel, for hours if not days on end, was 18 years old. And so Americans just leaving high school had this sense of almost dread hanging over their head that they may get drafted before they got into college. And if they had no chance at getting into college, there was this constant fear of being drafted and sent to Vietnam. In the, what you might call the anti-war movement, there are actually different branches of the anti-war movement. We often hear about the hippies and the yippies. Yes, there are things called the yippies. Who were the hippies? Well, actually, I'm looking at what you might call the hippie generation here online. The hippies were an extreme variant of the counterculture. They agreed with many of the principles of the New Left. So you may be asking, what in the heck is the New Left? Well, the New Left, as different from the Old Left. The Old Left, of course, are the New Dealers, those that supported increased government involvement in the American economy and American society. You had in the Old Left socialist and even communist. But the New Left, radical socialism and communism is even more apparent, even more pronounced. The New Left, for us historians, officially starts with the Port Huron Manifesto, which was published in 1966 by a group that would become known as the Students for a Democratic Society, or the SDS. Their leader, Tom Hayden, was a college student who, of course, could best be described as political radical, who believed that the American government was not only politically wrong, but also evil. That not only were Americans being exploited, working class Americans being exploited, but the New Left combined a hatred of classical bourgeois values and bourgeois society. When I say bourgeois, I'm talking about middle class, capitalistic values, with anti-imperialism. They view the Vietnam War as an imperialist war, as a war against these, well, third world nations that are seeking freedom. The Yippies get their name from a group that emerges in 1968 called the Youth International Party. Now, like the New Left, the Yippies were hardcore Marxist students seeking to overthrow the United States government and replace it with a communist model. So really the most active members of the counterculture were the New Left and the Yippies. The Yippies were kind of more political, concentrated on politics than the New Left. The New Left was concentrated on culture, for example. Because within the New Left, as we will see, emerged the modern women's movement, the modern, what you might call radical civil rights movement, or black nationalist movement is also sort of circumscribed in the New Left movement, as well as the infant gay rights alternative lifestyle movement. But we always hear about the hippies. So who are the hippies? Well, the hippies can best be described as those that support the New Left and yippie type of philosophy, but they're really lazy about it. I know I'm probably going to get some hate mail on this YouTube video for saying this, but really it is. The hippies were those that wanted to kind of zone out of society. They didn't want to, of course, go to war, but they didn't, of course, want to really force change upon the society. Instead, hippies believed that they would kind of create this social movement by creating their own alternative lifestyle. So they embraced things like communal living. Oftentimes you hear about hippie communes. This, of course, is where not only was all property shared, all the product or produce of the hippie commune shared, but many hippie communes combine free love with this, meaning that the idea of marriage was seen as square, seen as outdated. So you shared everything, including your sexual partners. So, these are some of the reasons why American society is changing, because the important demographic, if you will, important part of American society, the American youth, are being radicalized and changing during their formative years as young adults. Now, 1968. This, of course, is the election that kind of defines the split that is occurring in America. Because the Democratic Party, as we talked about at the very end of our last lecture, was split even amongst itself. Most of your left-leaning young people, for example, supported Eugene McCarthy. McCarthy was a stated anti-war candidate and sort of the standard bearer, if you will, following up after the election of Robert Kennedy. Now, the machine, if you want to consider the Democratic machine just like the Republican machine, the Democratic machine, their pick was Hubert Humphrey. Hubert Humphrey, a senator from Minnesota. Humphrey was, of course, chosen because he wanted to continue many of Lyndon Johnson's New Deal policies, but also continue the war in Vietnam. McCarthy was beaten out by Humphrey for the Democratic primary seat, if you will, to become the candidate for the Democratic candidate for the race, facing against the Republican candidate of Richard Nixon. As we, of course, talked about, Nixon was an unlikely peace candidate. Nixon, of course, championed the idea of peace with honor, of getting out of Vietnam with some semblance of victory. His major pull came from conservative America, older America, those that looked upon the counterculture with not only dismay, but with, well, they see it as a threat to the American dream. And the 1968 Chicago Democratic Convention only reinforces that America is something is definitely wrong. Because during the Democratic National Convention, you see clashes between anti-war protesters and the police, who had been ordered out in force by the mayor of Chicago, where, of course, the convention was held, Richard Daley. And what we see here, of course, is two riots basically taking place. Daley gave orders to the police to basically crack skulls and keep those dirty hippies, as Daley called them, out from in front of the where the convention was being held. Of course, this led to violence, and with the new media of TV, Americans got to watch it that very night. So Nixon, of course, won, being seen as not only as the peace candidate, but also the law and order candidate that many Americans wanted to basically restore that beaver-cleaver society that we talked about last class period. Now, 1968, we also see, of course, a change in civil rights. In 1964 and 1967, you see a series of race riots in major American cities. For example, Watts, which is part of Chicago, which is part of Los Angeles, I should say, in Chicago, in Detroit, in other major American cities. What triggers these riots, and what triggers a change in America's civil rights movement? Well, the big reason for these riots is the continued complete failure of being able to change the lives of many inner-city black Americans. Martin Luther King, of course, had risen to fame and become a champion of voting rights and rights in the South, fighting Jim Crow. But what about the northern version of Jim Crow? Why was it that the poorest inner-city neighborhoods were almost exclusively black? Why was it that it was hard for black Americans to get a job? Why was it that we see an increasing number of illegitimate births in the black community? Why is it that American blacks cannot have the American dream. This led to what you might call a more aggressive, more angry form of civil rights. And civil rights starts to transition away from what King openly talked about, which is finding a place at the table of mainstream America, and instead focusing upon what becomes known as black power or black nationalism. Now, there are various leaders of the black power movement, but one of the most noted one was Malcolm X. Malcolm X represented urban blacks, whereas King represented southern blacks. Malcolm X, of course, grew up in America's cities. I can't remember just off the top of my head where he is originally from, but of course he had been arrested, he had spent time in prison. This, of course, is where he converts to the Nation of Islam, which is a black Muslim religion. He argues initially, before his conversion to Sunni Muslim, or Sunni Islam, that blacks have to segregate themselves, but do so in an empowered way, meaning that instead of being segregated but still dependent upon white landlords or other groups that own businesses in black neighborhoods, that blacks need to focus on dealing only with blacks, that they improve themselves by using all of their resources within their own community. Now, of course, Malcolm X will change his tune, not all the way, but to a more inclusive form of empowerment after his conversion to Sunni Islam. Famously, he says that he saw that everybody was one inside his new faith of Islam. And of course, returning to the United States, he ran afoul of the original group that he was a member of, the Nation of Islam, which was led by Elijah Muhammad. And in 1969, Malcolm X is assassinated. That same year, Martin Luther King was assassinated, just like Robert Kennedy was assassinated that year. So these three deaths trigger even more racial tension because the Kennedys had been seen as friends to black America. Of course, Martin Luther King had been a champion of voting rights, and Malcolm X had been seen as the champion of urban blacks. All three deaths, of course, lead to more tension in America. By the end of the 1960s, it's not just civil rights for black Americans as well, as we're going to talk about later on in this online lecture. We also see movements for other minorities, Native Americans, Latinos, those that are on the periphery of mainstream American society and believe that they have been left out. Now let's quickly kind of sum up the end in Vietnam. I know we went over it in class, but let's kind of rehash it again. Now, Nixon's main policy in Vietnam was getting out. Let's make no bones about it. Nixon wanted to get out of Vietnam. This is one reason why he started a policy known as Vietnamization. This is what you see down here, about midway down the screen. Vietnamization was the policy after 1969 of turning an increasing amount of the responsibility of the war over to the South Vietnamese Army. The United States would continue to send massive amounts of money and military aid to the South Vietnamese. But basically the 400 or so thousand American combat troops in South Vietnam would be scaled back ever increasingly, so that by 1971 the numbers there are close to or under 100,000, and by 1973 there would be no American combat troops in South Vietnam. How did Nixon accomplish this? Well, he did so in sort of what you might call a carrot and stick kind of policy. The carrot was détente. Détente is French for cooling off. Nixon, behind the scenes, was in secret negotiations with both Communist China and the North Vietnamese government. His Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, was basically jet-setting around the world, secretly meeting with the leaders of these two communist countries, so that, let me give you the exact date, guys, so that by 1972, Nixon makes a public meeting, makes a public flight to Beijing, meeting with Mao Zedong. Here we are, right here. There he is, there's my pointer. And what comes out of this meeting? Nixon promises to recognize the communist government as the legitimate government of China, stripping away American recognition from the nationalist government of Taiwan in exchange for China to pressure the North Vietnamese to the negotiating table. They cut off aid to the North Vietnamese, and of course they closed their border with the North Vietnamese. This of course allows Kissinger to negotiate a meeting with the North Vietnamese and start of negotiations in Paris. This is of course the Paris peace talks that we hear about from this time period, starting around 1971 to 1972. The stick is that if the North Vietnamese became obtuse about things or pulled out of the negotiations, Nixon would order basically a resumption of bombing of the North in even more ferocity than what his predecessor Lyndon Johnson was willing to do. Nixon famously sent the B-52s into North Vietnam to bomb Hanoi and Haiphong. We basically carpet bombed that area. On top of this, Nixon in 1970 ordered the invasion of Cambodia. Now, Cambodia was technically neutral during the war up until that time period, but the Cambodian government, basically playing both sides against the middle, was trying to get American aid to fight their own communist threat, the Khmer Rouge, while not fighting the North Vietnamese as they sent men, material, supplies down the Ho Chi Minh Trail through Laos and into Cambodia to attack South Vietnam. Up until 1970, Cambodia had been a sanctuary for the communist forces. Nixon, of course, tried to destroy that sanctuary. It partially succeeded and partially failed. So, one of the things you just got to remember about this time period is Nixon is trying to, kind of like a boxer trying to get out of the room, is striking back with harder blows, but is in the process retreating. This policy of Vietnamization we see carried out in I think it's 1971. Let me make sure of this. Yeah, 1971, March of 1971, February and March of 1971, where the South Vietnamese attempt to cut the North Vietnamese supply line in Laos, which is just to the west of Vietnam. This Lam Song 719, as it's known, this operation, eventually failed, and failed pretty spectacularly. The South Vietnamese failed to protect their flanks. The North Vietnamese came in and cut off the leading elements and completely annihilated them. These were some of the last combat deaths for Americans, because while we had no combat troops in South Vietnam, we still had helicopter pilots, transport pilots, who many bravely tried to fly into this maelstrom to pick up South Vietnamese soldiers, and some of them got shot down. A year later, in 1972, March to October of 1972, we see the North Vietnamese making a conventional invasion across the DMZ into the northern provinces of South Vietnam. This, of course, becomes known as the Easter Offensive. Only with Nixon calling in massive airstrikes, again, B-52s carpet bombing where the North Vietnamese had set up shop, basically had taken control, only these massive airstrikes drove the North Vietnamese back across the border. It is the possible impeachment and resignation of Richard Nixon that eventually leads to the end in South Vietnam, because it was Nixon's personal guarantee to the South Vietnamese government that he would send in air support and continue to feed money and conventional weapons to the South Vietnamese government that allowed them to maintain at least an uneasy peace with their North Vietnamese neighbors. However, the Watergate scandal, which occurred, let's see here, let me give you the date real quick. Well, the Watergate scandal broke in 1973, but the actions that caused it happened in 1972. When Nixon is forced to resign in 1973-1974, gone are those personal guarantees. His successor, Gerald Ford, is a much weaker president. Ford was never elected in his own rights. He would serve out the remainder of Nixon's second term and then be defeated in 1976 by Jimmy Carter from Georgia. So he's not got the political clout necessary to continue Nixon's policy of aiding the South Vietnamese, and this is one of the controversies in American politics where the American Congress, our representatives, fearing political backlash from the ever-increasing hatred for this war among the American public, pass a series of laws that simply cut off the money and weapons to the South Vietnamese government, and of course Ford is unable to aid them militarily for fear of, well, being impeached like Richard Nixon was almost impeached. So starting in early 1975, the North Vietnamese, again thinking that they may be able to break apart South Vietnam in a series of offensives, invades across the DMZ. After initially holding up the South Vietnamese military and later their government collapses in the face of this onslaught, so that by April of 1975 we see pictures like this where Americans are being taken off the roof. This is actually the CIA headquarters in Saigon, and then of course we see the helicopters flying into the embassy compound in Saigon, pulling Americans and as many Vietnamese as they can under Operation Frequent Wind. Basically, that is the operation of American helicopters flying off of carriers in the South China Sea, flying into Saigon, literally flying over North Vietnamese forces to pick up Americans and South Vietnamese and fly them to safety. And those that are left behind, well, they are either re-educated, imprisoned, or executed. So Nixon did get us out. However, it's still debatable of how honorable that exit from Vietnam actually was. Okay, let's switch gears. Let's talk about America in the 1970s. The 1970s, of course, have been popularized by the early 2000s TV show, That 70s Show. And I actually use it in this slide. But before we talk about this, let's talk about what really characterizes the 1970s. The 1970s was a decade of stagflation, a decade of economic decline in this country. And where does this economic decline come from? Well, it comes from the fact that America helped create its own worst enemy. We rebuilt the Japanese after World War II. This Japanese miracle, as it is often called, where the Japanese bombed, their cities burnt to the ground, two of them nuked, are able to recover by the late 1960s to become an economic manufacturing giant. This, of course, is before the economic reforms of Deng Xiaoping in China, which allowed it to become basically the manufacturing center of the world. So American companies, which had become overly fat, and when I say fat, I mean they're fat with management, they're fat with pensions for their workers, all of these benefits that Americans enjoyed during the 50s and 1960s because of our booming economy, now become a dead albatross around the necks of many American businesses. The Japanese are, the best way to describe them, lean and looking for a fight. It also doesn't help that the Japanese don't have to worry about their own defense. The Japanese are protected by the nuclear umbrella of American deterrence. They're protected by American conventional forces stationed on the island of Okinawa, just a few hundred miles off the southern coast of Japan. They're protected by the fact that up until the 1960s, much of the military equipment that the Japanese Self-Defense Force uses originates in the United States and is paid for by the American taxpayer. So their money and their talent, their industry is not being sapped by the military-industrial complex. When it comes to Americans, the best and the brightest, they don't want to design cars, they want to design nuclear missiles and smart bombs and jet fighters. That's where the money is, that's where the action is at. And of course the American government is taxing the American public at an ever greater rate in order to pay for both a war in Vietnam, an ever-increasing Cold War, and of course the social programs of the Johnson Great Society programs. So we're handicapping ourselves in the face of a country that is designing cars that people actually want, are fuel efficient, and incredibly reliable. And this is important because in the 1970s, that reliability and fuel efficiency will come into play. So these are some of the issues of the 1970s. Now what about the American family? What about Americans in general? Well, during the 1950s and 1960s, places like Detroit boomed. If you can believe this, if you've ever seen YouTube videos about Detroit today, you probably couldn't believe that in 1950, Detroit had the third highest per capita income in all of the United States, only surpassed by Los Angeles and New York City. That means that per individual, the average wage of an American was better than any other place in the country. The Rust Belt was booming in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. However, in the late 1960s, that starts to change. It starts to change because, of course, we already talked about the demographic shift caused by World War II, where a lot of new factories were built during the war in places like Marietta, Georgia, Los Angeles, other places out west and in the south to take advantage of, well, lower power prices, TVA, and cheaper labor. So that as the American economy starts to decline and factories start cutting back, of course they cut back their older factories in the American Rust Belt. They just leave them idle. This is where the term the Rust Belt comes from. They just let them sit there and rot. And the problem with this is that American unions can't do anything about it. Union membership had boomed up until the 1960s because in many areas of the war, in many areas of the country, I should say, union membership was mandatory, but also unions had proven to many American blue-collar workers that this good life had been achieved through collective bargaining. But now, many American manufacturers who stayed in this country moved to states that were so-called, quote, right to work, meaning that you did not have to be a member of a union. Secondly, unions couldn't complain to the Japanese. They couldn't go on strike against the Japanese like they could American manufacturers. And many Americans, especially those that owned businesses of their own, or were middle management or upper management, viewed the unions as the problem, not the solution, because the union imposed high wages, even for those that didn't do very much in the factory. The benefits that companies had to give to their union members were excess cost that actually drove the partly drove the decline of American manufacturing. This was made even worse after the 1973 Yom Kippur War. This is, of course, a Middle Eastern war between Israel, Egypt, and Jordan. At the end of this war, since the United States had wholeheartedly supported the Israelis, sending American military equipment, even from American stocks in Germany. So there are cases where American pilots flew their F-4 Phantoms, landed them in Israel. The Israelis painted the American star out for the Star of David, and then left basically everything else there, including the American camouflage, and flew them into combat. This was not lost upon the other Arab states in the region. And this is why in 1973, 1974, we see the OPEC countries, which are the majority of the OPEC countries, are in the Middle East and, of course, are Muslim. They are staunchly against the Israeli state, and they attempt to punish or retaliate against the United States by basically refusing to sell us oil. This, of course, leads to the oil embargo crisis, where Americans at home, well, that big V8 gas-guzzling boat that you bought back in 1972, you can't drive it because you can't afford the gas. You may be out of a job because the factory can't afford the fuel or the electricity because energy costs are going through the roof. We see this change in how Americans are able to live. In the 70s show, there we go, I couldn't tell you what any of these characters' names are except for this man right here, the father, Red Foreman. Red is the quintessential American working man in that TV show. You can tell that I know a little bit about it, but I didn't really watch the show that much. But I watched it enough over the course of its seasons to notice a change in the lifestyle of the main father figure, if you will, the father knows best Ward Cleaver character of the 70s show. He starts out as a well-paid automotive worker. Halfway through the show, he's laid off. He tries to start his own business, but because of things like, of course, higher power prices, other economic developments, and stagflation, we'll talk about that here in a minute, he's forced to basically give up being a small business owner, owning his own mechanic shop, and go work for what amounts to Walmart. So what is stagflation? Well, this economic decline in this country led to a unique economic phenomenon known as stagflation. Normally, when an economy goes into decline, we see this in the Great Depression, we see the value of the dollar start to go down because people don't have the ability to buy things because they're not getting paid, and thus the demand for goods goes down, and as a result the price of goods goes down. We see deflation after a while in most recessions/depressions. The problem of the 1970s is that the economy goes into decline. People are laid off from work, or they have to work lower paying jobs. But the price for goods stays high, and the reason for this is because the U.S. government continues to have high spending. The government is pumping money into the economy through things like, again, social programs, but also the war in Vietnam, even during its conclusion. In short, the government is printing money in order to pay for increased deficits, basically spending more money than it's taking in tax money. That's what a deficit is. So they make up the difference by printing more money. Well, when you put more of anything out into an economic system, the value of that thing, that could be a dollar bill too, gets less and less. So we have this thing called stagflation, where the economy becomes more stagnant, but inflation remains in place. And of course, the combination of all of these things leads to a loss of confidence in the ability of America to lead the world economically, to guarantee that American dream for the average American. And what do Americans see on the TV? Well, we see attempted peace with our enemies. We see, of course, in 1973, the Paris Peace Accords give us a peace, if you will, where the North Vietnamese and the South Vietnamese live in this uneasy peace. Of course, this uneasy peace is backed up by the handshake agreement of Richard Nixon to the South Vietnamese government that if they ever needed us, we would bomb the crap out of North Vietnam. By 1975, that peace in Vietnam is the peace of failure, the peace of defeat. We see, of course, the recognition of Communist China. Many Americans are against this. They feel that we are selling out our allies on the island of Taiwan. And then, after 1976 and the presidential election of that year, we see Jimmy Carter's policies following in the footsteps of Nixon and Ford, where Carter is basically drawing down America's posture against the USSR, instead favoring what he calls moral diplomacy. In short, moral diplomacy is the attempt to make peaceful treaties with the Soviet Union. The most notable one is Jimmy Carter's negotiation of the SALT I Treaty. The SALT I Treaty, let me see if I've got this date really quick, was signed in June of 1979. The SALT I Treaty put a cap on the number of warheads that the United States and the USSR could have in our nuclear arsenals. And Carter trumpeted this as the future of ending the Cold War. Excuse me. The problem is, in late 1979, the Soviet Union would invade Afghanistan, and we'll talk about that here in a minute, but that only disproved Carter, and of course this led to even more dissatisfaction in the United States, as well as many Americans questioning our ability to stand up against the Soviet Union, especially an aggressive Soviet Union in the late 1970s. Now, what about other places in the world? Vietnam had sucked up so much of the American attention span that Americans were shocked to see in the 1970s that there were communist movements throughout South Vietnam. If there wasn't communist dictatorships emerging in places like Nicaragua, there were right-wing dictatorships in places like Argentina, where you start hearing about people being black-bagged, never to be seen again. Even in Asia, American power is seen as weak. For example, right after our leaving in the Vietnam War, there's an incident called the Mayaguez incident. This occurred in mid-May 1975. By May of 1975, the Cambodian communists, the Khmer Rouge, led by Pol Pot, had come to power in Cambodia. They had started to violently restructure the Cambodian society. Now, while Cambodia had a very small population, between 1975 and the early 1980s, Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge would kill 1/4 of the Cambodian population. And this violence was not limited to just the Cambodian people themselves. The Khmer Rouge was incredibly aggressive outside, to the point where they invaded or attempted to invade Vietnam, that had just, of course, emerged from its own war with the North Vietnamese communists being successful. So we see in this incident a communist country going to war with another communist country. Outside of the land dispute between Vietnam and the Cambodians, we see the Cambodian Navy attacking shipping in the South China Sea. One of these ships was the U.S.-flagged Mayaguez. The Mayaguez, of course, was a cargo ship seized by the Cambodians, and of course the American crew taken captive. And of course, during this time period, the U.S. government had to negotiate the release of the Mayaguez crew. And instead of doing so through force, basically saying, let them go or we're going to bomb you, the United States government effectively decided to pay a bribe to the Khmer Rouge. And of course, this did not look good both to those outside the United States as well as the American public. Now, the 1970s, we also see, of course, the emergence of these minority movements. We see, of course, black power, black nationalism, black separatism sort of climaxing during the early 1970s. But even if you're not talking about the black power movement, we also see, of course, the tamer civil rights movement coming to a head in the 1970s. What I'm talking about is a simple question of where people live. In 1971, the Supreme Court case of Swan versus Charlotte Mecklenburg, a school district, said that local municipalities had to take active measures to make sure that not only were schools equally funded, but different racial groups were equally represented in the schools themselves. Because what had happened in all parts of the United States, not just the South, was that you had either through active segregation, Jim Crow, or de facto segregation, we had black schools and white schools. Black schools tended to be worse. They weren't as funded as well. They didn't have as good of teachers. Well, let's just put it this way, they sucked a little more. And so this Supreme Court case set in motion a policy of taking children from white schools and busing them to black schools, and taking black students from black schools and busing them to white schools in white neighborhoods. So what you see is people who move to areas. I want to live in this neighborhood because I want to send my kid to this school, are now watching their kids being loaded on buses and taken to a school that could be miles away. And of course, this creates a lot of resentment on both sides. We see this in this picture right here, where we see a white American and a black American fighting it out with, of all things, an American flag used as a weapon over the issue of busing. Because white Americans, many of which who had come to see themselves as supporting civil rights and political equality, they don't want their kids being used as tools in this political argument. And so what we see again is this time period of tension in the country. Now out west, we also see the rise of several other minority movements. In the American Southwest, we see what can only be described as a brown power movement. Cesar Chavez was the leader of, oops, using the wrong mouse here. Let me see here. Hold on. I want to give you the actual name so you can look it up sometimes. Let's see here. The National Farm Workers Association. He was the founder and head of basically an organization that represented the interest of migratory Latinos, those that basically pick produce and move from place to place. By the 1970s, a very large percentage of that migratory labor force were Hispanic. And Chavez and the National Farm Workers Association argued that because of their different culture, because of a language gap, if you want to call it that, because of their migratory nature, especially since many of them came across the border from Mexico to take advantage of seasonal work, it opened the doorway for exploitation and abuse of these workers. And so Chavez led this campaign for, again, workers' rights, but especially Latino rights. On the American West Coast, where you see a greater representation of people of Chinese, Japanese, and various other Asian backgrounds, we see various Asian awareness movements, again, arguing that America has kind of ignored Asian Americans, and we wanted to see them getting a greater sort of what you might call a greater chance at the American dream. And then finally, we see, of course, a rebirth of tensions between Anglo-Americans and Native Americans. The 1970s, of course, was the 100-year anniversary of the so-called Indian Wars of the 1870s. And sort of to go along with this, many Native American activists helped found the American Indian Movement, or AIM. AIM's aim was the restoration of certain Native American claims of land, as well as Native American rights. The reservation system by the 1970s had been an utter and complete failure. Unemployment and alcohol abuse was chronic among many Native Americans in the American Northwest and upper Midwest, places like the Dakotas and areas like that. So what we see are instances like the taking of the Wounded Knee massacre site. This occurred in February 27th, 1973, where members of the American Indian Movement took control of the national landmark that was there, armed themselves, and basically proclaimed that this land was their land. This would eventually be resolved, but again, these tensions illustrate that Americans are no longer seeing themselves as monolithic, and that those Americans who had been at the periphery of American society are politically or even violently pushing their own group's agenda, if you want to call it that. On top of this, we of course have a revolution in sex. We have, of course, the emergence of the modern women's liberation movement by the 1970s. Women who had been taking part first in the civil rights movement and then in the anti-war movement had broken away from these groups because, to put it bluntly, they had been treated as second-class reformers. I remember reading the biography of one of the women involved in the modern women's liberation movement. I can't remember who it was just off the top of my head, but they were talking about how they started out in the very late 1950s working for those freedom rides that we talked about earlier in the class, and then working when they got in their 20s for the anti-war movement. And they said that their male counterparts basically viewed them as coffee getters for the civil rights movements and bed warmers for the anti-war movement. So that by the 1970s, many American female reformers had decided that if we're going to have civil rights for black Americans, we're going to have a more equitable society that is less warmongering, that women are going to have fair representation as well. That is their argument. This is why in the early 1970s, many women's rights activists stressed what would become known as the Equal Rights Amendment. Now, the Equal Rights Amendment, let me look this up real quick. The Equal Rights Amendment was a proposed amendment to the Constitution that would basically make it against the law to discriminate against women in any way, in voting, in hiring, in basically it would erase any distinction between men and women. Now, while the Equal Rights Amendment was defeated by 1979, it was not put into effect. Many of its concepts would be passed as regular laws in the late 1970s and 1980s. Because This was the era of the new woman, the empowered woman, the working woman, the woman who is a person unto herself, who does not need a husband, who has a career of her own, who is any man's equal. The quintessential new woman was epitomized by Mary Tyler Moore. Mary Tyler Moore, of course, was the main character of the Mary Tyler Moore television show, in which she was the worker. She was a employee at an office where she was spoken down to. She was treated badly. Most of the men were sexist, but in the end, she was the most competent worker there at the office. We also see, of course, the idea of the new woman being pushed in a new magazine called Miss Magazine. Not Mrs. Magazine, but Miss Magazine. And so this magazine was supposed to, and was founded to be basically the voice of not just independent women, but young independent women. So what we see here, of course, is the politics of a person's sex and gender becoming central to American culture, and most importantly, American politics. Now, culturally, we also see, of course, radical feminists. Radical feminism is intimately tied with the gay rights movement as well, because many radical feminists were homosexuals. And not all lesbians are radical feminists, but almost all radical feminists are lesbians. And these radical feminists of the late 70s and early 80s argued that women, like black power, women needed to separate themselves from the male environment, that they needed to have a, I guess what you might call a women's only society. Now, at the time, in the late 1970s, this was a small minority, but these ideas can be seen even today, popping up in the political conversation, especially when we talk about sex and gender. Now, another issue about sex and gender that popped up in the 1970s was the idea of gay rights. The whole meaning of gay changed in the 1970s, because if you go back to the 1930s, 1940s, and you listen to songs, people talk about this fellow's gay. Well, they're not talking about him being homosexual, they're talking about him being overly happy. But gay, by the 1970s, had become a synonym, a sort of a offhand expression that meant mainly gay men, but also gay women. And see, gays had been actively oppressed during the Cold War years. And there's a reason for that. This is one reason why during the witch hunts of the HUAC committees and the McCarthy hearings of the 1940s and 1950s, that people's sexuality was so interesting to Congress and the Senate. You could lose your job, especially if you worked in the government, if it was found out that you were homosexual. And the reason for that is quite simple. Homosexuality was not culturally acceptable during the 50s and the early 1960s. If a person was known to be gay, they, of course, would be ostracized. So most homosexuals kept their lifestyles secret. But in keeping it secret, it opened them up to being blackmailed. And communist spies, especially Soviet spies, often would target purposely. They would try and find out about your sexual habits, because if you were, let's see here, somebody who enjoyed an alternative lifestyle, something, whether it be that you just slept around a lot, or if you were homosexual, or if you did something else, that was something that could be used against you. And this, of course, is why the subculture of homosexuality was always kind of behind the scenes, that gays had their own bars, that gays had their own nightclubs, and they protected these because, of course, they wanted to maintain their own anonymity, as well as the fact that in many communities, including at the time San Francisco, homosexuality was against the law. It was called laws against sodomy. And so the trigger for the gay rights movement, let me see if I can find it really quick. Now, the Stonewall Inn was a bar that was raided by New York City Vice Police in June of 1969. Normally, when these raids were undertaken by the police would arrest the people attending the bar and have them do a perp walk, if you will, outside. Now, the Stonewall is the exception to the rule, because instead of going quietly to be arrested and booked and photographed, the gay men inside fought back. And so this initiated the whole gay pride movement, because from that moment on you see increasing openness, the fight for acceptance both culturally but also political rights, the outlawing of laws that of course would target gays, like again sodomy laws that justified the raid that initially happened at the Stonewall Inn. So what we see here of course is again the politics of sex. Now, up until now, you might get the impression that the majority of Americans were breaking up into what many criticized as the hyphenated society, that I'm a African American, that I am an Afro American, that I am a Italian American, that I am a Native American. But many Americans believe this to be a very bad thing, that this was having a negative effect on the country. This can best be seen by a television show again that played during the 1970s called All in the Family. Now, the interesting irony about All in the Family is that its main character, Archie Bunker, was intended to be an anti-hero, to be someone to be made fun of. The writers and producers of the television show were actually trying to make fun of traditional Americans, because Archie Bunker was bigoted. He used, derogatory language. He basically was a crotchety old man. But the thing about Archie Bunker was that All in the Family became incredibly popular with Americans, because older Americans who didn't subscribe to these movements that we just talked about, saw in Archie Bunker themselves. They saw someone who saw all of these changes, that saw their son-in-law, Meathead, this character right here, not as the future, but instead someone who was stupid for giving up the gifts that America was providing. But also they saw in Archie Bunker the man who couldn't find anything to do about it, that he was just one individual railing against the windstorm that was all of this social and cultural change happening in America. However, by 1972, however, we see that backlash, that resentment to all of these reformers and radicals taking shape in the re-election of Richard Nixon. Because again, as I told you, Nixon had been the popular whipping boy of the American media throughout his first term as president. However, he was re-elected in 1972 because of his stance against what he called the establishment. Nixon, who had been a politician his entire adult career, was attacking the political class that he was a member of. He also was one of the first presidents, Republican presidents I should say, that broke the Solid South. I don't know if you guys know this, but from the time period of the end of Reconstruction, 1876, all the way up to 1972, states like Virginia, sweeping down through the Carolinas into Georgia, Mississippi, Louisiana, were solidly Democratic. They voted Democratic for president. They had Democratic governors for the most part. The majority of their House members and senators were Democratic. They had not voted for a Republican president since the 1870s. However, in 1972, Richard Nixon, not targeting the racial question of the South, but instead arguing that he was the candidate for law and order, the candidate for stability, the candidate for Americanism, won over white Democrats in the South. This so-called Southern strategy helps us understand how we now see the American South as a bastion of Republican support, not what it was, which was Democratic support. Now, Nixon, of course, would win in 1972, but be forced from power in 1973, 1974. This all gets started with a break-in at the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C. in June of 1972. A security guard notices that a door is open and discovers several men inside going through the contents of the Democratic National Headquarters, which was located there. One thing you've got to understand about the Watergate complex is half of it is a normal hotel, the other is an office building. And within this rented office building, one of those offices was the Democratic National Committee headquarters. Now, many of the members of these burglars, if you want to call them that, were members of the Committee to Re-elect the President. Its acronym being CREEP, which is kind of ironic. The members of CREEP were also members of the Plumbers. Now you're going, this is getting really weird. We got a organization known as the Committee to Re-elect the President, known as CREEP, and who the heck are the Plumbers? Well, the Plumbers were an unofficial group formed by Nixon and his presidential advisors to fix leaks leaking out of the White House, because one of the things that Nixon was paranoid about was the fact that he couldn't seem to go to the bathroom without it winding up on the front page of the New York Times. So he founded this group to basically hunt down leaks, to hunt down what was going on. These Plumbers, of course, traced some of the leaks back to the Democratic National Committee headquarters. So this is one of the reasons why they broke in. They wanted to find out who was leaking the Democrats all of this information. Now, what came out during the committee hearings investigating the Watergate break-in, since members of the break-in group were members of this impromptu organization linked to Nixon, this meant people had questions. Was Nixon involved in this? Did Nixon okay this? Did Nixon order this break-in? Did the president order a break-in against his political enemies? It was discovered during these Watergate hearings that Nixon had an enemies list where he had journalists, politicians, business leaders that he wanted to not kill, but he wanted to use the power of the presidency to injure politically, economically, through so-called dirty tricks. This is part of what the Plumbers and the members of CREEP did. This is why Nixon was forced to resign in April of 1974. He was avoiding getting impeached because as these hearings went on, it was discovered that Nixon audio recorded all conversations in the White House, including the Oval Office. The House subpoenaed those records. Nixon initially fought, saying that this was presidential property. This was the personal property of the president, and the separation of powers meant that Congress could not listen to these tapes. However, the Supreme Court ruled otherwise. And when Nixon turned these over finally, on one of the tapes, 6 to 7 minutes had been overwritten. And not just overwritten, but scrubbed. I mean, you recorded over that same spot of tape over and over and over, because even today, They cannot recover even a ghost of the audio recording on that tape. And so many question, was that 6 minutes Nixon ordering the break-in of the Watergate Hotel? As I've already told you, Nixon would basically resign to avoid impeachment. His successor, Gerald Ford, would pardon him. Now this is very interesting because normally a presidential pardon means that you're pardoning somebody who's already been convicted of a crime. Nixon was never impeached and thus never tried, thus never convicted, but Ford is pardoning him nonetheless in 1974. 1976 rolls around and Jimmy Carter is elected presidency. We've already talked about his moral diplomacy and his disarmament. Carter would suffer probably one of the greatest political blows in 1979. 1979, you see two major events. Number one, you see the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. What is that? Well, we'll talk about that. Let's see, do I have something on that? No, I don't. Okay, back. The invasion of Afghanistan began in 1979 after a communist government came to power in Afghanistan, but was immediately opposed by conservative elements within that country. One thing you've got to remember is that communism at its core is an atheistic religion. And the new government of Afghanistan not only tried to push the communist ideal, but also did things that we may agree with, like, for example, opening up education for not only young boys, but young girls as well. Allowing women to go without the traditional burqa and head garb. This, of course, offended the traditionalist society of Afghanistan, leading to the formation of what would become known as the Mujahideen. The Mujahideen, of course, is a rebel force that had initially enough power to threaten the Soviet-supported communist government of Afghanistan. This would lead to the Soviet Union moving in its own military forces in late 1979 and taking over the country, setting up basically a puppet regime, leading to an almost 10-year war, 1979 to 1988, whereupon we see, of course, the Soviet Union trying to suppress the native Mujahideen, quote, freedom fighters. The second slap in the face of Jimmy Carter was the 1979 Iranian Revolution. The 1979 Revolution got its start years before. It was a revolution against the last monarch of Iran, a man by the name of Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi. Now, the Shah, as he was known, was a Western ally. The United States supported the Shah because the Shah allowed the United States to operate out of Iran on spy missions against the Soviet Union, and also provided oil during the oil embargo. However, by 1979, radical Islamic elements had gained enough foothold, especially among another core demographic, young Iranians, to overthrow the Shah. The Shah would be forced into exile. He would die of cancer just about a year or two after fleeing in 1979. But since the United States had supported the Shah, and especially supported his secret police, what was their name? Can't remember the name of the Shah's secret police, but let's just put it this way. The CIA would be proud. These guys suppressed any dissidents, disappeared individuals. The Shah, while a Western-oriented leader, was no Democrat, a small d Democrat. So what we see here are the combination of the United States, again, supporting oppressive governments, supporting religions that, well, in some parts of the world, they don't like. Again, the United States supporting Israel supporting Israel at the expense of neighboring areas, leading to the Iranians led by Ayatollah Khomeini. Let me see if I've got Khomeini's full name here. Yeah, I just have Ayatollah Syed Khomeini. Well, you just need to know Khomeini. Led by Ayatollah Khomeini, that the United States was the great Satan, that we were the cause of all the problems in the Middle East. And during this Iranian Revolution of 1979, the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, as what they were called. Basically, this was a paramilitary organization of young Iranians, stormed the American embassy in Tehran, taking the embassy staff prisoner, hostage, holding them hostage for several hundred days, almost a complete year. This, of course, would mean that Carter would be the president that initially had to try and deal with this. After a failed rescue attempt, where you see American Special Forces, the Delta Force actually crash in the desert and several of them be killed. Carter looks to be impotent, looks to be that he can't manage our economy. Basically, Americans lose faith in Carter. This, of course, leads to the election of Ronald Reagan.